I recently found some Let's Read type channels on YouTube and decided to try and write down an experience I had had a few years ago, as it seemed similar to the content being posted. I'm 27 years old, a male, live in UK with my fiance, and currently work as a teaching assistant for teenagers with special educational needs. I've worked in a number of schools and children's homes now, and these buildings, especially the children's homes, are usually old, renovated houses or halls. This particular story happened in 2013 when I had just started working as a support worker at a care home for teenagers and young adults around 18 to 30 years old with autism, brain damage, and challenging behavior. The house that I worked in was pretty big. There were 2 living rooms, a large kitchen, a games room, a study, and 5 bedrooms. There was also a huge garden with a summer house or activity room that led onto acres of fields and woodland. I'd been working there for about 3 weeks and primarily worked the waking night shift. This shift ran from 10 p.m. until 8 a.m., and it was my duty to make sure all of the residents were settled for the night and to get the cleaning done before the day staff came in to take over. I would usually get all of my jobs done for around 1 a.m., spend the rest of the night listening out for anyone that woke up. I would watch TV, read my university course books, or sometimes just play games on my phone once I had finished. The residents usually just slept all night. On one particular night, a young man named James, not the actual name for legal reasons, he was particularly restless though. He was not very big, but he had a lot of strength behind him. When he got into one of his bad moods and the slightest thing could set him off, he once threw a member of staff through a patio door because she had forgotten to put cold water in his tea before he drank it. He could not form full sentences and would communicate with fairly simple words put together in a way that only he understood. For example, he would say something like, "James, make breakfast," when he was ready to go make breakfast, or "James, go outside," if he wanted to go outside and play. He was generally well behaved and could be quite funny when he wanted to be, but was well known for his temper. At around 11 p.m., James got up and came downstairs to make a drink. I stood in the doorway and watched to make sure he didn't break anything or hurt himself, and he went back upstairs without any real bother. I sat on the top step and kept an eye on his door for maybe 15 minutes or so, just to make sure he didn't wake any of the other residents. Once he had settled, I went back to my cleaning. The room beneath James' bedroom was a communal living room with board games, a TV, sofas, books, and stuff like that. I was in there dusting and mopping the floor when I heard something heavy drop onto the floor in the room above. I knew James was prone to temper tantrums if he got frustrated, so I went upstairs and knocked on his door. As I reached for the key to open it myself, he opened the door and looked at me. He seemed perfectly calm and his eyes looked almost half shut, like he had just been asleep. I asked if he was okay and he said yes and put his thumb up. This was something he did when he was in a good mood and not stressed out, so I left him to it and told him to be careful, thinking that he had just knocked something over. An hour or so passed and by now I was in the kitchen cleaning the sink. I heard another bang above me, again, like something had been dropped. This time I realized that the room above the kitchen was currently empty. The house was set up to house 5 residents, but there were currently only 4, and the room above me was the spare, empty room. I immediately went to check it out, but the room was empty. I stood there for a while, and as far as I could tell, everyone was asleep. Due to the nature of their conditions or behaviors, each resident has an alarm fitted to their door that is activated at night, so if anyone leaves their room, a small receiver box that the night staff carry around makes a noise and a light blinks for a few seconds to indicate which door had been opened. The alarm had not gone off, so I knew that the noise was not from any of the residents. I got back to my cleaning and didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. The following night, I got to work just before 10, and as I entered the hallway, I could tell that something was wrong. James was at the bottom of the stairs covering his ears and humming loudly, and 3 staff members were there with him. After a few minutes, he was escorted to the sitting room, and the house manager gave me a rundown of what had been going on. For the last 4 hours, James had been quite agitated and kept repeating the phrase, "Sarah, little girl," when asked what was wrong. This was something we had never experienced with him, before, and the general conclusion was that he had seen something on TV or in a movie that stuck in his head and made him repeat this phrase. Once James had settled in bed, the night staff left and the other member of staff that was sleeping in went up to the staff bedroom. I got on with my tasks and, as usual, finished around 1 a.m. Soon after this, I went upstairs to do a quick check on all of the residents, but as I got onto the first floor landing, I noticed the light had been turned off. There were two small corridors leading to the bedrooms on the left and right-hand sides of the staircase. James' room was on the left, and the light switch was just outside his room. I turned the corner to flick the switch, and there, in the darkness and complete silence, was James. He stood in the corner completely naked, with his eyes as wide as he possibly could hold them. I'm a big guy, 6'3" and weigh about 220 pounds, but at that moment, I was really creeped out. I spoke calmly to James and asked what was going on, and for a while he said nothing at all. Then, as I turned the light back on, he let out an ear-piercing scream and started slapping himself around the face. The sleep-in staff woke up at this point and helped me to calm the situation and get James back into bed before reassuring the other residents that everything was fine. After that night, I had 4 days off. My shift pattern was 7 days on, 2 days off, followed by 8 days on and 4 days off, and I was relieved that this incident had happened just as my time off began. I got back to work the following week and was told that the situation with James talking about the little girl had got a lot worse. He would spend hours staring out of the window that overlooked the garden, saying, "Little girl, where are you, little girl?" And no one knew where he had heard this phrase. That night, around 3 a.m., the alarm went off to say that the door to room 5, the spare room, had been opened. Now, this instantly seemed a bit weird, as the door to the spare room is always kept locked because it was used for storage at the time. I went up to investigate and found James right there in the room in the dark. He didn't seem to notice me entering and just stood there whispering, "Where are you?" over and over again. I gently touched his shoulder and said something like, "Come on, mate, let's get you back to bed. It's late." James turned around and started heading back to his room, and for a second I was relieved. But then, as I locked the door to the spare room, he screamed out, "Oh no!" and started pummeling the door with both fists. As he did this, the alarm went off to indicate that the front door had been opened. The only people with a key to the front door were myself, as the night wake staff, and the house manager. The door has 4 locks on it, 2 that require a key and 2 that require electronic ID cards. It was now 3:25 a.m., and the manager never came in before 8 a.m., so I presumed there must have been some kind of mistake and continued to defuse the situation with James. He finally calmed down and went back into his room, so I went downstairs to check the front door. To my surprise, it was wide open. I shut it immediately and started checking every room in the house, just in case someone had got in. I then checked on each of the residents to make sure they were all still in the house. Everything was fine. The next night, everything was calm until around 2 a.m., when one of the other residents, Connor, got up and said that someone was tapping on his window. I guess that he had just been dreaming, as his window was on the 3rd floor of the house and was at least 25 feet from the ground. I went back up to his room with him to just reassure him and checked his window. Sure enough, it was shut, and the security lock that prevents it from opening wide enough for someone to fit through was still sealed. As he got back in bed, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside of his room. He froze for a second and looked at me with an expression of pure panic on his face. I opened the door to see who it was, but no one was there. He was clearly scared by this and said, "Is he back?" My blood ran cold and I asked, "Is who back? What do you mean?" Connor looked over my shoulder and then sank down into his bed, pulling the duvet up to his mouth. I turned around to see what he was looking at, but there was still no one there. "Tell him to go away," Connor said in a hushed, scared voice. I tried to reassure him that there was no one there and left his bedside lamp on before leaving the room. I went downstairs and sat outside on the patio with a cup of coffee. It was the middle of January and around -2 outside, but I felt like I had to get out of the house for a little while. After about 40 minutes, I went back inside and washed my cup in the sink, dried it, and put it back in the cupboard. Beneath the cupboard was a locked, secure drawer where all of the sharp knives are kept until needed. The drawer was open slightly. This was obviously a major issue as none of the residents were allowed access to the knife drawer without supervision. I counted the knives and realized that there was one missing, so I woke the sleeping staff, told her the situation, and we began a search. Nearly 2 hours later, we still hadn't found the missing knife, so decided to just keep our guard up and make sure none of the residents were hiding it. 2 hours later, at 5:30 a.m., the alarm sounded. It was the door to the spare room again. I went up to check it out and found that the door was locked. How could the alarm have been activated by the door opening if the door was still locked? I went inside and turned the lights on. To this day, I still have no explanation for what I found, and I often think about this incident. The bed had been pushed from its usual place and was against the wall, and the wardrobe doors were open. There were screws and nails all over the floor, but nothing was broken. But the most disturbing part? In the middle of the room, there was a children's doll, a gold bracelet, and the missing knife from the kitchen. The doll was an old-style baby doll. My guess was that it was made in the 50s from the style of clothes and the overall look of the doll. The bracelet was simple but old-looking. I left everything as it was and reported it to the manager as soon as she arrived. No one ever claimed that the bracelet belonged to them, and it was taken to a charity shop soon after along with the doll. After the doll and bracelet were removed from the house, James seemed to calm down and never mentioned a little girl or stood around in the dark again. I still don't have an explanation for everything that happened, and sometimes think that it was just a combination of strange behavior from a young autistic guy and the fact that the house was old. But on the other hand, a lot of stuff happened that I can't explain logically. My only regret now is that the doll and bracelet are gone and can't be examined or identified. Maybe it was paranormal. Who knows? But now I worked day shifts and do not plan on working night shifts again anytime soon. I can't really remember how it all started, but it was when I was very young. I never knew how to explain it to anyone, or if what I was experiencing was even real. Many times I tried to bring myself to ask for help, or to share my story, in hopes that someone may understand. But I could never quite get the words out when I started to speak, filled with an overwhelming sense of fear and anxiety, as if something was stopping me from trying to escape the nightmare. The nights would always start the same, dreary, cold, and alone. The earliest point of memory is staring out my window after school with the fall wind blowing and the dark clouds continuing further and further throughout the sky. As night fell and I would lay my head down to sleep, I would feel like I was drowning, not with water, but with fear. Always I would feel like it, or they, were watching me from the darkness of the room. With every peak of the light of the moon crossing my window, the shadows would appear, but also scatter with human-like movements around the room. Out of breath and sweating, the hours would pass on, and as I would almost fall asleep from exhaustion, bang! Another sound. A fence flying open, a shed door creaking, wolves, if that's what was there, howling from the distance. The shadows would continue to stare at me with a soul-piercing gaze. Sadly, even in sleep I could not escape the terror. When the exhaustion caught up, my body would finally fall into a slumber. My eyes would open back up, but the dark room I remember was now lit up. Not bright, with warmth and light, but dim and red. All around me was silence. No more wind blowing, no more windows slamming, and no more shadows. Until I hear whispers, but not quiet, soft messages, rather deep, ominous, and terrifying speech. Goosebumps arise all over my arms, and I shiver inside as on the outside I try to move to run out of the room, but I can't. My body is stuck, frozen under the covers, and I try with all my might to move, but it's hopeless. The room begins to get darker. Not darker like less light, but a deeper, darker red. If I can't move, maybe I can scream for help. Surely someone would be able to hear my cry for help before whatever is happening becomes worse. Sadly, this too ends in failure. I try with all my might to produce any sound I can from my mouth, but only silence comes out. My little body is immobile, and my screams for help go unheard. The shadows start to appear from the corner, slowly moving from the bottom to the top of the room. I can see from the corner of my eye they are getting closer. The whispers become louder, and I knew that whatever was here now did not have good intentions. I felt my feet and legs begin to be grabbed, and slowly my body was being forcefully pulled to the edge of the bed and into the darkness below. Trying to fight for my life, I could still not move, and I gave up fighting and finally fell, only to awake screaming and covered in sweat. Fear like that is hard to explain, as you were so helpless as a kid, and no one is there to save you. Sadly, these events didn't stop and continue on to this day as an adult. Reading similar experiences, the only thing that has helped or stopped these events from happening was screaming the name of Jesus as loud and as hard as I could. I wasn't a Christian at the time, but oddly this did work on many occasions, but the events never stopped happening completely. I still feel like I'm being watched often, and feel like the shadows are there, waiting for the time when I am weak, depressed, and anxious. I find it hard to sleep knowing that whatever was occurring in my nightmares may show itself again. But with hearing other people's similar experiences as I got older and sharing my story, I have a better understanding of the supernatural and believe I can't be crazy. There has to be truth to these experiences happening. Anyways, I know my truth, and that's all that matters. Maybe one day I'll be strong enough to fight the shadows and end this battle for good, in fear that this would be passed down to my kids. I am a 25-year-old female. For the purpose of being anonymous, I will refer to myself as Sabrina. I'm from Romania. English is not my native language, but I shall try my best to make this story easy to be understood. My stories contain what you would call angels, spirits, demons, archangels, satanic people doing forbidden sessions of voodoo, and everything else, but for this particular story, I sort of believe this is not necessarily a bad encounter, or so do I lie to myself sometimes. There are many stories that I would love to share with you. You can either decide to share them, I don't mind, but mainly I just wish to talk with someone who has went through what I did and can understand and empathize with it based on your personal experiences. The one story that I can and will share with you for now, I need time to think if I'm ready to share the less fortunate experiences for now. I live in Romania. Our country has Orthodox religion, basically very similar to Christianity. We believe in God and Jesus Christ, with small certain similarities and differences. For example, I don't know if it's the same as Catholics do. We keep the deceased for a night. We call it the sleeping duty or night guard. We do not take that body out of its house he or she has lived in for their entire life in order to help the spirit find its way to heaven easier. The next 2 days, as we bury the bodies after 3 days, we take the body to the church where the loved ones to the deceased may come and pay respects to that person. After this process is concluded, we bury the body at the cemetery where the priest will chant prayers, helping the spirit of the deceased understand that he or she is no longer among the living. As Romanians are very spiritual people and believe in the afterlife, spirits and even in bad spirits that linger the world unable to move on. Understanding this is important as the story is pretty detailed itself. I had 5 grandparents. My first grandfather, we should call him Michael, died when I was 6 years old due to a heart attack in August of 2007. He raised me and his death marked my life ever since because I couldn't grasp the significance of death. I would frequently dream about him, his messages, his signs. I would hear in my dreams as he would guide me to be a good person and so on. But even then, as a child, I knew what was a dream and what was reality. His wife, whom we shall call Anna, was my adoptive grandmother, as my real by-blood grandmother, named Margaret, had died when my mom was 2 years old due to an abortion. I'm not sure if she was trying to abort my mother or a third child, since my mother has a brother and she was the second child. This was during the communist years, 1946 to 1989. Romania had a strict law regarding abortions, and women would abort the fetuses on their own, in the privacy of their homes by themselves, as no medics would agree to help with the procedure due to fear of being sentenced to life in prison. She died of septicemia, and my mother grew up without a mother until the age of 6 years old. Needless to say, I never met her and knew anything about Margaret, my blood grandmother. But this story is about my grandmother, the adopted one, named Anna. She was a very spiritual, wise, kind-hearted, and intelligent woman. She never had children of her own. She adopted my mom and uncle. Their names aren't important for the story. My grandfather, Michael, was only dating my grandmother, but after my mother had met her on a family visit on her side in Aiza, Moldova, it's a town in Romania, they got married soon after. My grandfather was a military general, and raising two children of 6 years and 13 years was hard. How they decided to get married? Well, it was thanks to my mother, because as soon as she first saw Grandma Anna, she went straight to her at the age of 6, raised both her arms up and asked, in a jolly child voice, "Hi, my name is Christina. Would you like to be my mommy?" My grandmother burst in tears, picked her up, and immediately created a connection with my mother, whom she raised and loved as her own. It was not the same for my uncle, as he was 13 at that time and knew his own mother, Margaret, had died, and why. He denounced her and made her life much, much harder. After raising my mom and uncle, my uncle had two children of her own, a boy and a girl. She raised the girl, and when the boy was born, she had a calcium crisis that made her faint, and she hit her head. She refused to raise my cousin afterwards, as she was afraid she would drop the baby while she was holding it. My uncle never forgave her for that and hated her even more. When I was born, I was the light of their life, as she loved my mother from moment one, and my grandmother Michael adored my mother. Because I am a replica of my mother, same eyes, same face, same body shape, they immediately took me in and raised me as my father. Worked in 3 different jobs, and my mom was a pediatric nurse and worked in shifts. I loved growing up with her. Like I said, she was an extremely spiritual person. She loved to meditate. She would tell me about her dreams. She taught me how to decode them and what it meant. She told me about ghost encounters she had in her life, and always told me not to fear any spirit that comes close to me in my life, because ghosts, they see us as beams of light, guiding them to God when they are confused. Yes, that was my grandmother Anna for you. She did this until I was 18 years old. We were very close, and I was living 5 minutes away from her, so I'd visit her daily, sometimes still sleeping at her place. Her hobby was to read the future in some cards she had owned. Not tarot cards, but normal cards with some inscriptions she had, such as Encounters with Mysterious Man, Beware, Crying Child, Careful, Dangerous Woman. I can give you photos of the pact. It's just that the words are in Romanian, but I can translate them for you if you wish. Also, I would have to go to my parents' house since I have moved from there, and the cards, they remain there. On the New Year morning of 2017, at about 3:15 a.m., I called my grandma Anna to wish her a Happy New Year and to let her know how much I and my family loved her and appreciated her. I like to mention that Romanians rarely express their love by saying "I love you" to our mothers, fathers, grandparents. We consider that you show your love by what you do in your life and how you respect them rather than just say the words. But that night, for the first time in 23 years, at that time in 2017, I felt the need to tell her that. I still don't know why. Her voice changed. You could hear her chuckle and soft, happy tears as she would hear and said she loves us back and forever will. Nothing seemed suspicious, as I am a very sensitive and emotional woman myself, so the night went on normally. She was at a party, and I was at my fiance's house. The next day, the 1st of January 2017, at about 5:30 p.m., I received a phone call from my father who told me that Grandma Anna had died the previous night. I couldn't express in words how my heart simply left my body, as if my own existence stopped, refusing to acknowledge that she was dead. I rushed home. The police were there. So was the ambulance. They say she died of a heart attack due to the climate change, same as my grandfather Michael did 11 years before her, by the same cause. Outside it was cold, inside the house was hot, and as she was rushing to change her clothes, her heart couldn't handle the temperature change, her body couldn't balance the heat, and she died. But what I found particularly weird is the time of death. I still had her last phone call, 3:15 a.m. The policeman and ambulance staff analyzed her and declared her time of death was around midnight. He said there was no way I could have talked to her at 3:15 in the morning, for by that time the body would have already begun the rigor mortis stage. Who did I talk to? Because it was her phone number, It was her voice, and she seemed incredibly fine. Call it a sick joke or just medical staff time of death error, but creepy. During her funeral, I decided to write her a goodbye letter. As I am very spiritual, and even though no one will read it, I like to consider she took the message I had sent her and to heaven to pass it down to my other grandmother, Margaret, and two grandfathers, Michael and Peter. I wrote in that letter that I do love her a lot, that I thank her for every sacrifice she has done for me, and that I wish to tell Margaret that I love her too, although I have never met her. I put that letter in my grandmother's coffin, kissed her forehead, and watched her go on her last road. My mom knows about the letter. She's yet to ask me about what I wrote in it, though. After her funeral, I get a phone call from my grandmother. Yes, my Nana Anna. At first, I thought it was my father, as he would still use her phone to tell all the relatives from other countries that she had died. So normally, I answer the phone and I hear something unimaginable, impossible, formidable. I hear my Nana Anna. I hear her voice clearly. I hear her laughly voice with intermittence and static occurring whenever she would pause. It was a soft, fading voice, but nothing scary, nothing fearful or intimidating. It made me feel like she was indeed there. But I will admit the whole situation did freak me out. She said to me, "Hello, dear. I called to let you know I passed the message and I love you too." I couldn't reply, as the phone call hung up right after. It left me feel so vulnerable, as I thought maybe someone was playing a sick joke, but it couldn't be that. I saw my Nana Anna be buried myself. I saw the coffin be sealed. I saw the letter exist inside the coffin until the very last second. No one took it out to read it. She had 3 sisters, but they were all dead and none of them had her voice. No one could have repeated her voice that perfectly. But the even scarier part comes after my first phone call. After another week, I remember it was during another day of Monday, right 1 week after the first phone call. My phone starts ringing again under the same number. I answer. Already I've forgotten about what had happened, and I hear an old lady, a voice I couldn't feel familiar. I did not know who that lady was. It was a pretty soft but strong voice. It felt like a relatively young woman, but an experienced woman. I would say around 30 to 40 years or so. I would like to mention that at this time I was in the same room with my father, who owned her phone still, and I received this call. Her phone is in front of me on the table and not ringing. I open her phone as I speak on my phone. Her phone had no battery and it was dead closed, but I still get her phone call. I answer. I hear this weird lady, and it goes like this. She says, "Hello, sweetheart. You don't know me, but I do. I received your message and I love you too." Then the phone call hangs up again. Needless to say, I started screaming and panicking so hard that my dad immediately went to the telephone service to find out who was playing these pranks on us. They went through her profile, the numbers dialed, and received. My number was not in her agenda of calls, so we decided to disable her number. Ever since then, we do not receive calls anymore, but I do go to the cemetery more often and talk to them. This year is the first year from her death, so we are sort of celebrating her memory. But for me personally, I do not celebrate her memory, as I feel she is constantly physically with me. I often have dreams of her. She would often visit me at night. I'm saying dreams because I feel like I am going insane if I ever conclude on these situations being something other than dreams. I guess I'm trying to thank you for giving me the possibility to share this with you. If you want to share my story further, to all the people out there who encounter ghosts or paranormal activity, I'm going to say what my grandmother Anna taught me all my life. Do not be afraid of them, as they are just lost, confused souls who see you as beams of light helping them to find God. The way you feel about them will conclude in the way they react, and afterwards end up scaring you.